Now, I'd like to now call on our first two panellists to come up to the front, which is Ian Harper and Ryan Messmore. So if Ian and Ryan could make their way up and grab a seat on the panel. Just while they're doing that, I'll introduce them to you. Ian Harper is, of course, one of Australia's best-known economists who's worked in both in academia and business for many years. He's currently with Deloitte. He was head of the Australian Fair Pay Commission from 2005 to 2009, and is also, as many of you would probably be aware from a little bit of publicity in the last 24 hours, is now also heading up the competition policy review for the federal government. Ryan Messmore is the has been the president of Campion College in Sydney since late in 2012. For anybody who doesn't know what Campion College is, it's Australia's sole dedicated liberal arts college located in the west of Sydney at Toongabbie. And the liberal arts that it teaches at Campion College are philosophy, theology, literature, science, history and Latin. Ryan has degrees in public policy and religion from Duke University in the United States, and also when in the United States worked at the Heritage Foundation there. So I'd like you to make welcome Ian and Ryan, and I'll join them on the panel. Now, the format for our panels today is we've asked the people who are appearing on them to be prepared to make short opening statements of around about 3 minutes, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion on the panel, and then we'll throw it open to questions from the floor. So we'd like to start. Ian, would you like to kick us off today with a little bit of an introductory comment about some of these key issues of Western civilisation?
Richard. Thanks very much. Yeah, that's right. Thanks very much, and good morning, everyone. Look, it's an enormous topic that we've been asked to address this morning, but of course a very important one. I'm neither an historian nor a religious scholar, but I am a believing Christian and somebody who believes very fervently in the values of Western civilization. Let me just give you a brief overview of how, if you like, I put those two things together, or if you will, where I see my religious faith in the Christian tradition more broadly supporting Western civilization and the values of Western civilization. Firstly, if you think about the values of liberty and democracy that we've had drawn to our attention, that people might use to summarise some of the great values of Western civilization, I am immediately drawn to one of many statements of St. Paul in the New Testament, but the one that comes to my mind is from Galatians, where Paul says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm and throw off the yoke of slavery." Now, you can interpret that in its context in different sorts of ways, but my reading of the Christian scriptures indicates strongly to me a theme of freedom for the individual that is linked strongly to autonomy in a moral sense. Let me come back to that in a moment. So for liberty, there's Paul on freedom. Indeed, elsewhere in the New Testament, Paul talks about obeying the authorities. For a long time, as you're aware, the church didn't necessarily oppose slavery, although ultimately when slavery and the trade in slaves was thrown aside, I think I'd like to claim that Christians had a very strong role in that, including, of course, William Wilberforce and Henry Thornton and the others of the Clapham sect. On the question of democracy, indeed, the church throughout its history has lived through various regimes, and there are times, no doubt, when an historian would point out that the church has been in an unholy alliance with the powers of the day. But I'm going to assert, just for the purposes of discussion anyway, that the church has opposed tyranny, whether it's of the communist or fascist or straight out simple dictatorship variety, that the church basically has opposed tyranny, sometimes successfully and sometimes, as I say, ineffectually, but I think it has. So those two things, liberty and democracy, I want to argue that the Christian tradition, Christian religion, undergirds those two things. It isn't the only source. Obviously, one goes back to classical traditions and can find related themes. But I do want to claim that the Christian religion undergirds these ideas at base because Christianity asserts that human beings are made in the image of God. Janet didn't use that language a moment ago, but she was very close to saying something that I would interpret that way as a Christian. Being made in the image of God underlies our moral autonomy, the fact that we have rights as an individual. We are a person individually loved by God, individually created by God. And with that comes responsibility. We are individually accountable to God. In the Christian faith, both of those things are true. And does this mean that we then support a rampant individualism where we have absolutely no concern for anybody else but ourselves? Well, I think if you knew anything about the Christian tradition, you'd know that that is completely incorrect. Christ himself said, "Love one another as I have loved you." The point is, to rephrase Paul, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Amongst other things, freedom to love one another as Christ loved us. So the tradition of compassion that sits alongside the respect for the individual, those two things walk together in Christianity, and I think that we recognise both of those things in the great Western traditions. Yes, the respect for the individual, rights and responsibilities, but the acknowledgement of the fact that we live in community and society and that we band together and support one another. How we do that? Through the structures of government and through the enforcement of rights, to give ourselves the ability to live those lives that we have reason to value, as Noel Pearson describes it, is an important part, again, of the Western tradition. And again, I'm not an historian or a scholar in these matters, but let me just give you three references which I've found very helpful in my thinking about this from three authors who do have a claim in this area. The first is a delightful read by a theological scholar of the Eastern tradition, actually, a man called David Bentley Hart from Yale. Some of you may be aware of his work. A delightful read called The Atheist Delusion, which was an answer, of course, to Dawkins and friends. Setting aside the points that he makes anti-Dawkins and such like about the basis of theistic belief, Hart is an historian and just gives a wonderful historical overview of the growth of the early church and its relationship with the state through that time. A related book written by a secular sociologist, Rodney Stark, called The Rise of Christianity, deals with similar themes. I raised both of those books because what they do is to make it quite clear how revolutionary the idea of the moral autonomy of individuals was at the time of the early church. How revolutionary it was in the Roman Empire that someone would actually show somebody else compassion. The atheist emperor, Justinian, called upon his atheist cohorts to do what the Christians did, to emulate them in caring for the poor and the sick, because they were giving, if you like, the atheists a bad reputation. The early part of the church was known for the fact that Christians showed compassion to one another, as well as having their strong sense of moral autonomy and dedication to God. So these are revolutionary ideas, and therefore they're to be celebrated, because as they worked through into our modern times, you see those themes arising time and again, being challenged, and yet ultimately also succeeding. The third work that I found helpful, although it's really a very difficult read, I'd have to say, is by another sociologist, a man called Charles Taylor, who wrote a book called The Secular Age. This book, if you like, goes the other way. It starts with an understanding of what the religious tradition was and then talks about how that has morphed into the current secular view. Be that as it may, whether in fact religious faith is diminishing, it's nevertheless the case that these themes are utterly redolent in the Western civilization that we know and love. And so my point simply this morning is to open the discussion by saying I'm going to assert that Christianity in particular has a very important supportive foundational role in sustaining the values that we now recognise, even if we don't understand quite where they've come from.
Thank you, Ian, for that. Ryan, would you like to make a few introductory comments?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for those opening comments. I agree largely with them, and I bring to the discussion kind of an American perspective, and so I applaud and certainly agree with the grounding of religious freedom for individuals. I think what I would like to add to that, as part of our discussion, is the important degree of religious freedom that we also grant to institutions, not just individuals, but also the institutions through which individuals live their life. Individuals do love each other and exercise compassion, but a lot of times to do that in a potent and an effective way, we form these little platoons. We form organizations and groups that can feed the hungry and serve the poor and exercise the responsibilities that God has called us to do. And I think one of my concerns is the weakening of religious liberty, especially in the United States, for institutions. I think it's in the government's and in the larger society as a whole's best interest to protect what makes charitable organizations and communities effective in the first place. The government wants groups like the Salvation Army and local church soup kitchens to be functioning and to be serving the need. But it therefore has to protect what makes them effective and what motivates them in the first place. And oftentimes that is grounded in the inner logic and the convictions of that group's religious faith. C.S. Lewis has this wonderful quote about the foolishness of castrating and then expecting the gelding to be fruitful. And I would just apply that to this situation where the government cannot castrate institutions from their religious identity and their religious practices and then expect them to be fruitful for the state, serving in the ways that they serve best. And one of the problems I see, particularly in the States, is that the degree of robust religious freedom that has applied to institutions is being weakened right now, and the threat is that it's being watered down into a vapid freedom of worship. So we're moving from a robust freedom of religion to a watered down freedom of worship, where there does remain the freedom for individuals and institutions to profess their faith and to attend the church service of their choice. But what is losing protection is the ability for those groups to make day-to-day decisions about how they run their businesses and their activities based upon their deepest religious convictions. And unfortunately, this is coming through policies that sound favorable to religious freedom. Policies like religious freedom exemptions. But my concern is that the devil is in the details. The way that these religious freedoms exemptions define religion, it ends up protecting only a very small, narrow group of activities, persons, and institutions. So it protects prayer, protects singing religious songs, teaching religious doctrine. It protects pastors, protects churches and synagogues. But what it doesn't protect, and what it's protecting less and less, especially through policies like Obamacare, is local schools, orphanages, hospitals, business owners, to be able to make day-to-day decisions on who they hire, who they fire, what sort of health insurance they offer, and can be expected to cover, and that sort of thing. So the concern is that religious freedom remains protected in what a small group of people do on a Sunday morning, but it's not being protected for what they do in their daily lives on a Monday afternoon in their workplace.
Thank you very much. Just picking up on your comments there about the developments, particularly in the US, from what you've seen in Australia so far, I mean, you've only been here for a short time, do you think Australia's further down that path, less far down that path as the US? What have been your initial impressions of that?
It's a great question. I think Australia does well in one sector and less well in another. This goes back to the culture. I think the culture in Australia is more dependent and more just expecting of centralized government to be able to regulate daily decisions that we make. So in the States, I think there still remains more of a desire, more of an expectation to have those groups operate within a sphere of proper autonomy. Where I think that Australia does better than the States is there's a whole lot less litigation in Australia than in the States. It seems to me it's out of control. It's running rampant in the States, and the leading edge of that is anti-discrimination legislation, and so you already have across the United States cases where small private business owners either have to act contrary to the teachings of their faith or pay a steep fine. And more lawsuits are coming up, and more small organizations, bed and breakfast, local photographers, churches that own gazebos that are wanting to be rented out for same-sex union ceremonies. More and more lawsuits are coming down the pike against those sorts of organizations on the basis of anti-discrimination legislation. And so that would be my warning to Australia, is to be very careful about going down that track too far, or you will become mired in the litigation chaos that America is mired in right now.
And Ian, you obviously wrote a book about Christianity and economics and that topic. How do you feel that? I mean, it often seems to me in public debates, the Christians are welcomed into the public debate if they're talking about poverty and issues like that, but they're not welcomed into the public sphere if they're talking about issues of personal morality. How have we got to this situation where Christians' views on some topics are legitimate, but on other topics are you're meant to keep religion out of politics, as people say?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Richard. I've certainly been the victim, if you like, of that, what I regard as a double standard. And I've had to remind some people pointedly that the very laws which protect, if you like, protect people from me, right, and my religious convictions, also work in the direction to protect me from secularist idolatry, if I could use that term, and that I have a right to express my views, and I have a right not to be discriminated against, right? Independently of whether or not we want those laws around, let's just say, given that they're there, it sometimes strikes people as a surprise that I would say that, because they're inclined to think, well, hang on a second, these things are to protect people against those with these crazy Christian views, rather than the other way around. But to be fair, most people, when they're sort of taken aback, they say, okay, well, all right, so what have you got to say? And then, yes, I can express my own particular faith position, and, for the most part, people think, oh, well, that's sort of interesting and polite, and, I like to play golf, you like to go to church, that's fair enough. And I welcome that, and I don't think that is not, at least that's not my brand of Christianity, and Ryan can speak for himself, but my view, yes, is by all means I'd like to persuade and talk to people about what I think, what I believe. But no, on the contrary, it's not about, dragging you in. I mean, Christ himself, cut off the ear of those arresting him and told the disciples, no, don't get in the way of this. It's not something where we should be using the Bible in one hand and the sword in the other. Indeed, the church over the centuries has had lamentable episodes where that's been true, but that's not what I believe is at the core of the discipline. Richard, just to go slightly sort of sideways from your question, I do want to say something that was set off in my mind from Ryan's remarks. Members of the audience might be interested in this. It has to do with the question of religious liberty in our country, and how our various religious traditions are feeling a bit sort of under threat. We have been approached at Deloitte Access Economics, not just by the Christian church, then as it turns out, it's the Mormons who actually have started this process. But they have now formed an alliance with various other arms of the Christian church, as well as the Muslim Council, the Council of Jewry, and the Buddhist Foundation. And they've gathered together a sum of money and come to us and asked at Deloitte Access Economics if we could undertake some economic and sociological research. We've got several sociologists involved with us in this project, to estimate the economic value of what religious communities provide. Right? Interesting. Now you might say, this is to get more tax deduction. No, they're actually abjuring that, because I asked the first question, said, no, don't even go there. Right? No, that's not what it's about. And I said to them, but you're already getting a tax deduction for the things the state would otherwise do, like education and health. Oh yes, we understand that. So what are you asking for? Now, we want to establish the economic value of religious community life, religious activity, observance in communities. And this isn't just, the Roman Catholics or the Protestants. No. Muslim communities, Jewish synagogues, people engaged in community life. And so we went to the literature in the United States, and here's another comment on our society, Ryan. This literature in the United States, which is primarily sociological but bleeds into the economic literature, is enormous, just enormous. And people who write in this literature are at the very top of the profession, linking religious observance, community life, that sort of thing, right the way through to economic value and ultimately the impact on the state. In Australia, the first half of that link just doesn't exist. There is no sociological literature which links religious observance to changed behaviour. The next bit, changed behaviour through to the impact on the economy, sure, plenty of that. And Access Economics has even done some stuff there. So there is a strong current in our society, whether you like it or not, which regards religious activity as sort of maybe irrelevant at best or a nuisance. My concern with that is people forgetting one of the sources of nourishment for the values which we share. It's as if we have cut off the flowers from the tree, put them in a vase, and we admire the flowers, but we've forgotten that these flowers draw on deep roots of faith and value and observance which nourish them. And even if not everybody observes them, and that's okay, other people live within the shade of the tree and the flowers. But if you cut it off, one of these days it withers.
Well, I think that's certainly true, and I'm sure there's many people of all different types of religious belief or non-believers in the audience today, but I think any sort of study of the history of Western society and Western civilization, you can see that you have to look at it through that religious prism to understand, the great, secular writers who, developed, Locke and so on onwards, who were still in such a religious society that all their thinking naturally was based around the existence of a religious society. Before I just throw it open to the audience for questions, one further thing I'd like to ask you, Ryan, is how have you found the young people that come to your college in Australia? Obviously it's a bit self-selecting because they're people who are choosing to go to that college to receive that sort of education, but they're still the product of the school system in Australia. What sort of do you find that they come armed with much knowledge or understanding of the history of Western civilization, the principles that underlie it? What's been your experience of that so far?
Yeah, it takes a special student to come to a 3-year liberal arts college, especially in a context like Australia, where the motivation and the expectation all the way through school is success means get a job, get it as quickly as possible, decide what you want to do with your life at age 16, begin to narrow down, and just make money. That's the purpose of the university degree, is to get a job. And we're offering something different in Australia. We're offering a different purpose for education. And it takes a special student to want that, and a special family to make sacrifices in time and resources to get that. So our students come at least having had an interest sparked somewhere along the line. They read something in Dante. They studied history in a way that caused them to realize how important it is for the way we understand the world we live in today. Many of them are deeply spiritual and faithful young men and women, but they haven't had a very firm foundation to build upon. And so we find ourselves wishing that we could start with where many liberal arts institutions in Oxford and Cambridge were able to start in centuries past, but actually having to go back and address basic information about Western civilization and history and theology and philosophy that should have been covered earlier. So we feel like we're playing catch up a little bit, but it's a wonderful small learning community where there are people who recognize there's value in this, and this is only going to help us become more and more effective in whatever jobs we do get down the line.
Thank you, Ryan. Right, now we've probably got about 15 minutes to take a few questions from the audience. So we've got one up there.
Okay. Philippa Marta. Ryan, this is a question for you. As a practicing Catholic, I constantly have to field questions from my libertarian friends along the lines of, why is the Catholic Church in bed with the Greens? Why does the Catholic Bishops' Conference release stupid statements on social justice and refugees and economic policy? Why is it that electorates in Australia with large Catholic populations are invariably Labor-safe seats? So there's a number of really difficult questions for me to answer here. I do understand there has been a long march through the institutions in Australia, and as a result of that we have a leftist bureaucracy in our church. So really, in a sense, we're fighting our own churches at the same time that we're trying to spread the good word about liberty. I know in the United States there's been more progress made than here. Would you like to comment on that at all?
Yeah, social justice is such a loaded phrase. When I was at the Heritage Foundation, I spent 6 years there before I came to Australia, and that was my singular focus, is how to help the public conversation, the public discourse around social justice, because of the ways that it's often used to smuggle in bad policy under good intentions. And I think that the Catholic Church has explicit teachings about social justice, which include the need to care for those in need. And that's non-negotiable, that's central to the calling of the Catholic Church. What is often forgotten is that in the same teachings, in the same social encyclicals about caring for those in need and dealing with institutional structures that can treat people as less than human, is the call for subsidiarity. The recognition that people are able to care best for those in need who are closest to the person in need. They know them best, they can tailor-make the solution, they can walk with them as a human being over the long run. And oftentimes in the fervor, especially among young people, the fervor to do something to help, oftentimes I think the only person we can turn to is the they that you were referring to. If only somebody would do something about this, if only they would do something about this. And so they immediately look to Washington, D.C., or they immediately look to the national or international campaign that Bono from U2 happens to be encouraging them to sign up to. And they walk right past the small local institutions in their own towns that could do the most effective work, the families, the churches, the neighborhood associations. And so I think the task of the church is to communicate better the full scope of social teaching, which is within their tradition. Yes, we need to care for need. We need to pay attention to structures that could be treating people as less than human. But we also need to allow subsidiarity to work. And we need to not have the large institutions come in if or before the smaller institutions have had a chance to do what God has called them to do.
Richard, may I just add something to that? Again, something that may not be familiar to members of the audience who aren't sort of actively part of the church. Just picking up on Ryan's theme, at least on the Protestant side of things, and I'm an Anglican, the church planting movement is something to watch if you're interested in the small platoons. What our experience is, even right here in Melbourne, certainly in the Diocese of Melbourne, is the younger generation that Ryan just refers to basically have become so browned off with large institutional structures within the church, and plenty of reason why that might be true, that they've basically decided to do it themselves and start again. There's a young chap here in Melbourne who started out a church with 15 people. We helped him get going. That church now has 3,000 people every Sunday, all young people basically, and they meet in various Hoyts theatres around the city. They've got a league in with Hoyts who have venues like this they can use for their services. But the relevance of that for this discussion is that those same young people, of course, as Ryan rightly describes, and you know them as well as I do, have this tremendous sense of wanting to do something. So they have set up their own, basically, Meals on Wheels type arrangements, which they use to feed people in the high-rise in Flemington and in Carlton, just off their own volition, organise all that, do that. No one's, they raise the money themselves, they do all that sort of stuff. Other outreach to the homeless and so forth, reinventing these structures from the ground up. Here's something which I've observed as an older person watching the next generation, wondering where they are. How come you're not coming to these meetings? Why aren't you on the vestry? Why aren't you doing this, that and the next thing? And then of course I discover they're there all right, but they're building their own structures and starting again. To some extent I say don't waste your time reinventing stuff. Use some of the mechanisms that we put in place. Sometimes they do, but generally speaking, they just start again. And I find that extremely encouraging because none of these young people they've got no public subsidy. They don't want a public subsidy.
Yeah, they're not spending all their time filling in grant applications.
On the contrary.
No.
On the contrary. And of course, many of them are pretty well-paid young professionals. So they put their hand in their pocket. But what they really get enthused about is doing something and using their, the collective nous to actually create these things. It's just a wonderful thing to watch.
Because it affects so many community organisations, kindergarten, sporting clubs now, because there's so many grants available for all manner of minor things, but they all involve filling out endless forms. So the volunteers involved in these organisations spend hours and hours filling out forms to get a grant of $1,000.
Yeah, but here is the blessing. Because this is a religious organisation, they won't have anything to do with them. And so my guys say, all right, in that case, we'll do it ourselves. Terrific.
Fair enough. Right, next question. We've got one up the back there. Yep. Got a microphone up there? Oh, actually, who's got a microphone at the moment? Yep. James, whoever James is giving the microphone. Pete, up there. Right, Pete, go.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Adam Wakeling.
Then James.
I personally am not a believer, but something that I have noticed is that many of the institutions that have been most critical to the development of Western liberal democracy rose first in the Protestant Christian states of Northern Europe, such as Great Britain and the Netherlands. And this includes not only parliamentary democracy and the like, but also institutions of freedom of religion and of state secularism and things that are important to me and I think are so valuable to our success as a society. Does anyone on the panel want to comment about whether there is a link between Protestant Christianity and the rise of these institutions, or anything else on the topic?
We'll try to avoid having a sectarian debate on the.
I'll
have to referee. As the secular person on the panel, I'll have to referee.
Well, I would simply say that's true, and there's a reason that even beyond just political and economic and religious institutions, there's a reason that science emerged out of Western civilization. You have to start with certain assumptions about the kind of world that you're living in, what it means to be human. Does life have meaning? Is there order and meaning and beauty to be found in it outside of our personal thoughts and intentions about it? And because Europe has its roots in the Christian worldview, those things spring up. Yes, they've been perverted along the way and corrected, and but that was not by accident.
Yeah, I don't think I want to add to that.
Yeah. James, is that James Bolt?
If I could, Darren Middleton, I wonder if I could just ask, I'm picking a little bit up what Janet said earlier and what Ian has referred to in your opening speech. It reflects on that governments don't give us rights, they simply recognise that we have human rights. I wonder if part of this debate, though, and I wonder if you could comment on this, that the universal or human rights that we might think, those classical ones of freedom of conscience, of speech and religion, that in this matrix of rights, at least recently, it seems that special rights have begun to usurp them. So wherever there's a conflict in government or elsewhere between rights, what we might call the classical rights, freedom of speech, will be usurped by a special right, a right that's just to a certain group.
Oh, yeah.
I wonder if you could comment on that, because you started off with this assertion of Christianity, and I'd agree with that, that being made in the image of God means that people have these rights, these inalienable rights.
Yeah, yeah. You're taking me, well beyond my natural expertise, but let me just offer a perspective. I said that I think one of the key, if you like, messages from the Christian faith is that Christians believe that human beings, all human beings, every single human being is made with God's image. Now it's flawed because of the fallen world, but God's image is there, right? And it's that insight which, well, Ryan can comment, that's shared between the Catholics and Protestants. I mean, as a Christian, that's part of the creed, right? We share this. And it's that undergirds Christians' efforts to protect certainly the weak and the disabled and the slave and the prisoner and the poor, as well as recognising that we all have this, so that at some level we're individuals, each known and loved by God, but all in this together, right? And so I think the Christian approach is not to single out particular people and say you've got somehow special rights and special status, right? That's a very un-Christian idea. All right, so the church is hierarchical in some cases and not... Yeah, okay, all of these organisations are flawed and they reform over long periods of time, and I'm not going to defend sort of any of that as without flaw or sin, if you like. But the fundamental idea that as human beings we each individually count, even if we've got a broken body or a broken mind. I mean, honestly, some of the most moving experiences that I've had in my life as a Christian having that sort of brought right home to me. When I sat in church one time and a chap came in, this was in a different city, next to me, and they were just about to start the service, and he was obviously a homeless person, and he came and sat next to me. And then we started the service with an Anglican service, so using the prayer book. He opened the book, his book, and gave it to me. Right? And so I turned the page to where we were and pointed and gave it back, and he sat there. And when I turned the page, he turned the page. Right? I'm convinced that this man couldn't read. He really had, I think, no idea what was going on, but he was there. And I just felt the message coming through to me, whatever was being said up the front or done, the message that came through to me, see this person here? Right? This person's your brother. This person's loved by God just like you. And those sorts of people use different language to describe that, but I think it's very fundamentally human. Didn't Janet say the way human beings are made? Yes, that's right. And as a Christian, I might just go a little bit further, but that's right. And in the context of that, no, there are no special status for me relative to that person. That person's got a different set of problems to mine, a different set of opportunities to mine, and all the rest of it. But fundamentally, I'm called to respect and defend that person, as that person is fundamentally called to respect and defend me. And I'm as accountable, if you like, for that person as he or she is for me. So it's this tension between us having individual rights and responsibilities and yet being, as it were, in community and solidarity. Christianity, I think, wants to affirm both of those things, Ryan. Does that sound right to you?
Right, we might just have... There's a couple of people over here with one. You've got one up there? Yep. We can have the question there, and then we'll have one more from over this side. We just have time for one more from over here, so, yep.
Thank you. Luke McNamara. Ronald Reagan also said that appeasement only empowers your adversary. And when you talk about Christianity's role in Western civilization, isn't your role, this is a little bit confrontational.
Go ahead.
Isn't your role to speak out against the oppression of fundamentalist Islam, and in particular to the new rape defence of cultural differences
Anybody care to tackle that?
I think that the responsibility of the Christian body is to witness to the possibility of the kingdom of God, the relationships that God created as a possibility and wants us to enjoy. And not only, and so to critique those when those are being perverted and abused, but also to demonstrate by living as a body rightly the possibilities that exist and inviting others to consider that. So I think, yes, where people's relationships with God and with one another are being severely trampled upon and undermined, it's the responsibility of the church to stand up and say that's not right. And we need to help create conditions in which those right relationships, the proper way to treat young women, is lived out and possible. That's not the only responsibility. The responsibility of the church can't be limited to political lobbying for the causes it thinks stress. It also has to live a certain way as a body of people who relates redemptively to young women and young men and everybody in the community. But that would certainly be one dimension of the responsibility to love our neighbor, is to stand up against injustice, and where it takes place, the church needs to be calling attention to that.
Right, we'll just try and squeeze in one more question, but Dom's got one up there. Sorry, there's a forest of people here with their hand up. We've only got time for one more, so...
Yeah, hello. My name's Eamon Matheson. I'm a medical doctor. Although I hesitate to contradict Janet Albrechtsen, the comment about freedom of speech being most fundamental, I would argue that perhaps, and it's also recognised in pretty much every human rights instrument in International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, that freedom of conscience, thought and belief is more fundamental, actually recognised as non-derogable. And although I admire the IPA's work and many people's work on the campaign against 18C and freedom of speech, and I acknowledge what Ryan was saying about losing the battle on religious freedom in the US, I'd just like to point out that in Victoria, we've actually lost that battle, and we lost it 6 years ago when freedom of conscience was outlawed. And despite the fact that there is a lot of talk and a lot of press about freedom of speech, particularly from journalists, there's virtually silence on the issue of the fact that freedom of conscience was outlawed effectively for doctors, healthcare workers in Victoria. And I think that I'd just like to point that out, that that's where the state of Victoria's protection of freedoms is, and also to question or to wonder as to why there is such intended silence on the subject, which I suspect is related to the fact that it pertains to the issue of abortion. Thank you.
Right. Yes, thank you, Eamon. So can I just invite you to be to be clear that if you refuse to perform such a procedure because it's against your conscience, right? Then what are the sanctions? Do they take your license away, or are you dismissed from public hospital, or what happens?
It's not to actually do an abortion, but you are forced to participate in the process by mandating a referral. There's currently a doctor before the medical board who chose not to participate in a request for a late-term abortion for gender selection, and is being threatened with sanctioning on the medical board level and having his licence to practice revoked.
Right, to being deregistered.
Deregistered, yeah.
I think we might just take that, I suppose, as a comment, because pretty much we've now reached our time and we are determined to keep to time today. So I'd like to thank both Ian and Ryan for such a wonderful contribution. And you can always tell when speakers have engaged the audience, there's a forest of hands, and the number of hands going up seemed to increase the longer we went on with the discussion. So I think you were obviously doing something right in stimulating the audience's interest.